From the heart of the Low Country in South Carolina,
it's the Take Two podcast, where we take theology to the next level. Well, hello, and welcome back to Take Two. This is our second week of podcasting, and you were saying strange things were happening to you?
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you, have people just been stopping you in the street?
Yeah, I had one man stop me. He was like, "Are you the guy who does Take Two?" And it was pretty overwhelming. Asked for an autograph and a whole bunch of stuff.
I will say, from doing some market research here, I can confirm that we do have listeners as far north in the United States as Maine.
Wow,
pretty big reach.
That's pretty big. That's pretty big, and probably they don't even know us. They just found us and stumbled upon us.
Something like that. I wasn't going to say that Leanne's whole family is from Maine,
right.
But shout out to Nanny for watching our podcast. She makes the best coffee cake in Penobscot County.
Okay, all right.
So,
well, the next time I'm there, I'll have to stop by and get some. Yeah. So, so we're working through, and I want to say at some point in time, so maybe if you're listening to this sometime, this will already be true. I want to be able to say this podcast is available everywhere podcasts are found. But we're working through some technical difficulties with registering it with Apple. And I think as soon as that happens, we'll be able to truthfully say that. But,
come on, Apple, get it together.
But if you're listening to this, you found us somehow, and we appreciate it.
Yes.
I thought that maybe we would go over just some things that I have them marked as confirmations or corrections. So we had questioned whether Abraham had any children other than Isaac or Ishmael. And it is true. He did have other children. After Sarah died, he took up another handmaiden or concubine or something, wife.
That was good.
And
celebrate the wins.
Because
we got some losses coming
that
up.
That was our win. We did have some losses. We were talking about Paul going to be in prison with Festus and Agrippa. We both knew, I knew. Did you know it was in one of the Caesareas?
Well, this is embarrassing for me. Yeah. I did, because I have been physically to both of these places, and I said it wrong. I can envision, and it's like the water's right there.
Right. So it's maritime, not Philippi. So I guess Caesarea Philippi is up north, closer to the Golan Heights, and then Caesarea Maritime is near the sea, which is where he was held. And then the last one,
this one's very, on me too, I think.
Very minor, but we attributed a quote to Charles Wesley, and it was supposed to be John Wesley.
I feel like they're a package deal, honestly. They write hymns, and one's a preacher. I don't know. It's like they go together.
Yeah. So those aside, I think we're ready to pretty much launch. And just 30 seconds, we do look at our sermon on Tuesdays that was preached at our church, where Joel is our senior elder, and we're both part of the elder boards. And so that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be looking at his second sermon on the book of Romans. So we got some notes, and we're going to read the text. So today's text was from 1:8 through 17. And how about I read that for us?
Fantastic.
And then you want to just maybe start a brief overview on some of the introduction? Yeah. So let me read the text. This is Paul. He says, "First, I thank God through Jesus Christ for you all, because your faith is being proclaimed throughout the whole world. For God, whom I serve in my spirit in the preaching of the gospel of his Son, is my witness as to how unceasingly I make mention of you, always in my prayers making request, if perhaps now at last, by the will of God, I may succeed in coming to you. For I long to see you, so that I may impart some spiritual gift to you, that you may be established. That is, that I may be encouraged together with you while among you, each of us by the other's faith, both yours and mine. I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that often I have planned to come to you and have been prevented so far, so that I may obtain some fruit among you also, even as among the rest of the Gentiles. I am under obligation both to the Greeks and to the barbarians, both to the wise and to the foolish. So, for my part, I am eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, but the righteous man shall live by faith. All right, so there's our text.
All right, jumping into a brief overview of the sermon, and I don't know if the sermon notes will be posted on our website at CBC, but we should work on that.
Yeah. I think I assume it's something that Sermon Audio can do. So maybe we talk to Danny, or I don't know.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
We can make it happen. We know people at Charleston Bible.
Yeah.
If you have the notes, I'm looking at them right now. The title of Pastor Joel's sermon today was "I Am Not Ashamed of the Gospel," and he's leaning into that part in his overview, kind of saying, asking the question, are you ashamed of God? Are you proud of God in a way? And he's showing pictures of his grandkids. He's having some of the engaged kids in our church, talk about their fiance, and really leaning into that versus the other side of thing, the fear of man that might prevent us from sharing the gospel, which is so powerful that we don't need to be ashamed. We need to share that. And he comes back to this picture of Mount Everest, that we're embarking on this long journey, but not necessarily just because Mount Everest is the longest or the tallest peak, but that it has Romans by comparison is the most thorough treatment of the gospel. Right. That we're going to be here a while, but we're going to learn so much along the way, and like Pastor Joel always does, brings us up to speed. Quick review of last week with some of that greeting stuff, but then moving right along into the next section about this prayer Paul is talking about.
Yeah, and the prayer, it's one of those things that a lot of Paul's writing is very outliney. Like it's boom, 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 and it's easy to follow. And the prayer, he kind of weaves back and forth to, it's like, oh, Paul, you're praying a little bit right here. Now you're talking to the Romans right here. Now you're telling the Romans about your prayer life for them. But clearly, he says that he was praying for them often, and that he was happy that they were, that their faith had become known throughout the world. And Joel references Acts 18:1-2, and I think something that you mentioned, this first century historian last week, Suetonius, you pronounce it for me.
I think that's right. I was pretty happy that we hit it last week, and Jill hit it this week. I was like, this is good. This is good.
Yeah. But basically, he refers to the Jews being kicked out of Rome because of causing these little minor uproars and stuff over and over again, and mentions that they were following this guy named Crestus, spelled with an E. And Paul really is praising them. Like, he's praising God, but he's also encouraging the Romans. He's praising them like, hey, y'all are doing a good job. Your faith is being known throughout the world, because at this point in time, even though the Jews have left, the Jews became known who were following Christ, and the ones who remain were being well known. And William Barclay says that we can also often get the best out of others when we see the best in them. So if we can, encourage one another, build each other up, try to get the best out of them. And then Joel will often reference a verse in Proverbs 18 that talks about the tongue having the power of life and death, and those who love its fruit will eat from it. And so just like if we want to, build one another up, we can find the positives and we can encourage one another to keep going. And then he has a petition. Did you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'll jump on that. He's talking about his desire is to visit Rome, that he's been prevented thus far, but he wants to go there to impart to them a spiritual gift. And it's not just a one-way street. He wants to be encouraged by them. It wants to kind of have that going both ways. He doesn't give a reason, but it's been prevented. And from what you said and this, what moves me is, man, he doesn't even know. He's never met this church. It's right. Like, man, I don't do a good job. I mean, you can ask Michael. I've encouraged this guy lately. It's like I don't even encourage people in front of me. And it's like, man, Paul's going to great lengths saying, hey, wish I could be there. I can't. This huge introduction. So that's basically his petition. And one of his, well, I don't know if I want to kick it back over to you for this application section that where Joel kind of paused.
Yeah, because Paul even mentions in writing that he wants to do it, but he's been prevented. And so he thinks it's God's will ultimately, but he hasn't gotten that yet. And so Joel just stops right there, as he often does, and say, let's apply this to our own lives. Like, we need to, in his notes, we're plan and pencil, so that, sometimes we have a plan and God comes along and erases that plan. And we'll talk more about that when we go a little deeper on our take two towards the end of this one. But Joel also references James 4, where James is admonishing them, don't say we're going to go do this and this. Say, the Lord willing, we'll go do this and this, because you may not be alive. So if you're living, then maybe you can go do those things. And then he talks about a passion for proclaiming the gospel.
He mentions this kind of debtor. Yeah. He's got this obligation that he feels in debt, that he needs to share, and he's eager to share the gospel, kind of setting the way for the theme verses for this passage, as I'm sure we're all very, very familiar with, verses 16 and 17. For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith. As it's written, the righteous shall live by faith. And I know we've got this rabbinic formula in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 5, probably another passage where we're familiar with kind of this boiled down, like essential. Looks like you got it.
Yeah,
he's ready for it. I love it.
Yeah. So this to me is, especially if you're in the apologetics realm, Gary Habermas will talk about this, because Paul writes 1 Corinthians. It's one of the books that's not disputed amongst scholars, and he writes it probably, I think they say around 55, and he's referencing a time when he was with them before 55. And so when he would have told them this information, would have been before 55, maybe in the 50s. And then, but it was passed on to him when he visited the Peter, James, and John when he goes down to Jerusalem, which he details in Galatians. So what he's passing on is a very early kind of essential boiling down of the gospel. So I'll just read that. And he follows a rabbinic formula. So the rabbis would say, I pass on to you what has been passed on to me, which in contrast, remember Jesus said, you've heard, but I say to you. So that kind of astonished people, because he was teaching from his own authority. But Paul writes there, now I make known to you, brethren, the gospel which I preach to you, which you also received, and which you also stand, by which also you are saved, if you hold fast to the word which I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. And here's it is: for I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, which is Peter's name, then to the 12, and after that he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, and then to the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me also. So you have all these lists of, this huge apologetic of the veracity of who Christ is, and Paul is saying this is what the gospel is: Christ's life, his death, his burial, his resurrection. That is the gospel, and that's what he was eager to preach.
It's all just like the gospel in a nutshell. It's a great passage just to have memorized, because it's got it all. Not all, but
the essentials.
Got exactly.
Yep.
And then Pastor Joel kind of transitions and goes to what are some reasons why someone might be ashamed of the gospel. First reason he gives is that the gospel, it's offensive. You're talking about people being sinners, that they don't measure up, that they're missing the mark. People don't want to hear that. I think a lot of people, default, think they're pretty good by nature. Briefly touched on the way of the master, Ray Comfort, and his technique to get someone to admit themselves that they've broken the 10 Commandments. Because when you start going through the list, you kind of find out you're not hitting the mark, even if you thought previously you were. Talks about the gospel being foolish, alludes to this text in 1 Corinthians 1, 20 and 24, and really hits on, without the Holy Spirit, we're not going to get very far. That, the wisdom of God, it's foolishness to the world and a stumbling block to some, and that to some, they just look at it and say, hey, this doesn't make sense. I don't get it. That can cause someone to be ashamed to share it, that they're going to come off foolish.
It's really backwards because most world, well, I guess all of them except for Christianity, would say you're basically good, and if you are real good, then you can be with God. And Christianity reverses both of those. It's you're not good, you're bad,
You're not.
And furthermore, your path to back to God. This is kind of I kind of the both hint like so. The offensive part is you're not good. I take the foolish part to be your path towards God is not trying to be better. It's to give up and surrender and to admit that you're not good and to put your faith in Christ and the sacrifice. So it's kind of counterintuitive, opposite of the world. Yeah.
And then the last one, he talks about the gospel can result in great harm, especially in those days. Not so true for me. I don't know what harm. I know maybe climate's changing, that kind of thing. But Paul, he's in prison a lot, man. Right. You look at what's going on with him, it's like, wow, there's a lot of physical harm, a lot of suffering that is a result directly linked to him sharing the gospel. And we might, at least feel the threat of whether it's physical harm or, being ostracized or whatever it is. Yeah. Then he transitions to this phrase first, the power of God.
Yeah, so it's the gospel, and he's not ashamed of it, and it's kind of backwards, but now he has witnessed it himself. Like, he was transformed by this gospel. We know the road to Damascus story. It's such an important part of Paul's life that Luke tells it to us 3 different times. And so you can kind of see in Acts 26, 16 through 18, how he relays while he is in Caesarea Maritime, that he says, here's the purpose. This is what God told me that he had for me. And it radically changed Paul's life. And so he sees that power. And the next one was the righteousness of God. So the gospel, not only is it the power of God to deliver us from our sin, deliver us from our captivity, but it also shows us a righteousness. And Paul's going to get more into this in later on in Romans, but it is a way for God, and I don't want to steal our future thunder, but there's a phrase that Paul uses later on. He says it allows God to be the just justifier. And so he can still be just, but he's not just like winking over our sin. He's not just going, oh, okay, that's fine. Like the gospel, because it was a penal substitution for us, he was able to reveal his righteousness, his standard, while at the same time setting us free from that sin. So I'm sure that we will get more into that as we move on. And it also says that the righteousness of God is from faith to faith. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that, so we won't spend a lot of time, because that's one of the things that we want to expand on. But the bottom line is impossible to fulfill the law or to fulfill the needs of salvation through either the law or good works. And that's what we're talking about, like the foolishness of the gospel. You have to kind of let go and throw yourself at God's mercy, and that's kind of counterintuitive to our way of thinking, but that is what the gospel is. And then he goes on to say, for it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. So you want to talk about that one?
Yes, for it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. He talks a lot about Martin Luther. I don't think I'll go into his whole biography here, but it's great thing to check out if you're not familiar. And it was really when he started teaching, expounding on the book of Romans, came across this section, and that really shook his worldview. He said he's pondering these verses night and day and grasped the truth that the righteousness of God is that righteousness whereby through grace and sheer mercy he justifies us by faith. And he was going to great lengths to be the best monk he ever could be, and he just felt he could feel that he wasn't measuring up, that he was failing, and looking at it through the lens of a righteous God declaring righteous and unrighteous people. That just is a paradigm shift that really reframes everything.
Yeah, that's great. And I know we're not going to spend a lot of time, but one of the points that Joel brought out was how he would spend hours in the confessional booth inside a monastery. So there's like not a lot to tempt him. And I think he was even accused of like trying to shirk his chores. Like, you're just in here, so you don't want to have to like do the other chores and stuff. But he had a very sensitive conscience to his sin. I'm sure it was both thought and deed that he was confessing. All right, so as always, our sermons at CBC end up with some application questions. So I'll just read through these, and then maybe we'll kind of hit our take two, some where we expand. So again, memorize 1:16 through 17. So I'm working on that. I recited it to
Michael's killing it
to Zach before he got going. And then just different ways to witness. So Joel gave us some tracts that we could hand out. He suggests that we invite people to our Easter sermon, that we could pray that we would have boldness and be willing to speak and not be, have that fear that sometimes that we would have. And he says that Paul was thankful for the church in Rome. Who can we express gratitude towards? So just like Paul said, thank you, we should be able to express gratitude towards someone.
Is there something you want to tell me, Michael, right now?
Yeah.
Actually, I should be saying thank you to Michael.
No.
He's bending over backwards for
good.
some of this stuff. But it's a good reminder. It's like, man, Paul didn't even know these. He knew these people. He had not been with them. It's like so much we can encourage others to be thankful and express that gratitude.
Yeah, and then the last application was to take time this week to glory in our salvation in Jesus Christ, and kind of just be amazed at it. We don't want to be complacent with the gospel. And I think sometimes we've heard the gospel, we share it, we talk about it every Sunday. It can lose its freshness, but it shouldn't, because it's a great thing.
And even on that last point, I mean, he encourages us to think of specifics, what you have been delivered from and to. And I'm just thinking of you, Michael, not that big apologetic brain. Yeah. It's like, can you imagine thinking of the gospel as foolish? It's like, man, what a waste it would be to like chase down all the facts of the universe. It's like, you missed this.
And then not see the...
Yeah,
that's good. Okay, so we had some things down here we might expand on and touch on. And the first one was just the use of spiritual gifts. So Paul talks about wanting to go to the Romans and to impart a spiritual blessing to them. And so Joel talked about, that's kind of the nature of what it means to be an elder at a church or someone who kind of oversees or disciples. You really want to mature the folks in your congregation or who you're discipling, and you want to see them, to use like a sports analogy, to step out on the field, get into the game. And, we all have different personalities, different gifts, different, ways that God has shaped us, but to use those for his glory. And there's, when the spiritual gifts are mentioned throughout the Bible, there's kind of these themes of when we use them, they're not for us to be puffed up, but they're for the good of other folks. And I remember, I don't know, when was Jack, one of our former elders, was he when you and Leanne gave your testimony to join way back when?
It was Jack and Tim. Yeah.
So if he was there, I'm sure he said something like, we are excited because we want to pour living waters into you and to pour our lives into you, but we also expect you to pour your life into us. And so, that's kind of what Paul's talking about, is that mutual, we want to pour into you, we want you to pour into us, and ultimately that gives glory to God, because it represents a picture of Jesus Christ to the world. When Jesus was washing his disciples' feet, he's like, this is how the world's going to know you, your love for one another, and how you stand out. And Danny hit on some of that day in the history when the church was going under persecution, how they're normal people, but their love for others, their love for each other, and how they took care of each other stood out, and it was a testimony to others.
Yeah, I like that too, and the fact that that's how you really fulfill your purpose, not just being a consumer and taking, but that back and forth. And I've known Jack White a long time. I wouldn't say we're like best friends, but every time I talk to him, he's got like such insightful, he always has something so profound that I'm like, man, this is so good to think about. And if you're not pouring yourself back into the church wherever you're at, you're you're missing out. You know, the church is missing out and you're missing out, you know?
Yeah, you're missing. And so one of our things that I always I think of when we're doing this is that spiritual gifts, they paint a picture of Jesus. None of us on our own have all of them. You know, we're kind of fragmented. Someone might say stained glass, and we go together and we make this picture of who Christ is. And we talk about at our church being a beacon of hope a lot. That's the imagery that we use. We're on the coast, so there's lighthouses around us, and we have some imagery of a lighthouse. And we always talk about as the lighthouses, it's not really our light that we are shining. We're reflecting Jesus's light. And so for me personally, I always pray that we would reflect that light faithfully so that we wouldn't be on and off, that we would be a steady beam of reflection of who Jesus is, and that we would do it fully. So all aspects of who Jesus is. So like you wouldn't have parts of the beam cut out, but we would just be, if Jesus spoke on this and this was a part of who Jesus is, that we're reflecting that glory, and then it would be fervent. So it would be a bright light that people could see. And so, since all those start with F,
great analogy,
you know it's got to be from the Lord.
Alliteration
if they all start with F. So a beacon of hope that we're reflecting faithfully, fully, and fervently.
And that's good. And even with spiritual gifts, Paul later here says that he's like under this obligation, and it's interesting to think about. He's under an obligation to the Greeks. It almost seems like, he should be under obligation to God, but it's how God works through us, where you can never pay back God. You're missing the point, or it's not grace. And it's, he feels that responsibility to use how God has gifted him to impact other people for the glory of God.
Yeah, and he mentions Greeks and barbarians, and a barbarian to a Roman would be,
that's right. Yeah.
A foreigner, someone who can't even speak our proper language. They sound like they're saying bar, because that's how they got that name. And so he's saying, no, I'm giving the gospel to everyone. Yeah. Yep.
And then we maybe talk a little bit about this plan in pencil concept. I think that's a great way to look at it because, I think people can make the mistake of holding tightly to everything. Pastor Joel mentioned himself being the planning type.
Are you the planning type?
I really do like the plan. I think it just depends on what the context. I like knowing what's going on.
Does Leanne like the plan?
Leanne's more of a planner. She makes me look like I'm not a planner, to be honest.
Right.
So, as Pastor Joel's saying, hey, plan, don't hold too tight to your plans. Does that mean, hey, I'm off the hook? I don't have to plan. I'm just going to live by the seat of my pants.
Right.
Do you have encouragement for that person?
Yeah, well, I think that there are two extremes to avoid because there's all this wisdom literature through James, through Proverbs. Even Jesus would say before someone builds a silo or a granary, they count the cost. And so there's definitely nothing wrong to planning. Solomon would say in Proverbs that you should know the face of your flock. Like if you're a businessman, you should know the health of your herds. So there should be this planning part. So he's not saying don't plan. In fact, James would say you can plan, just say if the Lord's willing. So you might have people who, so I tend to be not a not planner, but I'm not, putting in, so that would be probably most of these issues, you're going to find yourself closer to one ditch or the other. And my ditch would be failing to plan, where others are like tightly holding to their plan. And there's a balance in the middle where we plan, we try to be wise, we try to be good stewards of what God's given us, but we hold that loosely. And so, if we're planning in pencil, if God erases our plans, we don't hold on to that stubbornly, and we can trust in God's sovereignty.
And I added the notes kind of at the last second. I can share it briefly from my life. I know we don't want to spend a ton of time here, but like, do you have a good example? I was thinking about my life. Is there an example where I had a plan and then things went haywire? And I think most of us, we look at our life, we see that.
Well, it's funny. I'll let you tell your story.
Yeah.
Because I think I know what you're going to say. But it is amazing if it's the same story that you and Leanne told right when you became an elder recently.
Yeah.
How much it mirrors mine and Jill's story. So
that's why I want to say it first. So if you say it next, I say you're just copying me. You got to get it there first. I had never set foot in Charleston in my life. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. My wife, Leanne's from Maine. We met in undergrad in the upstate of South Carolina, and I was going to physical therapy school, and really the only place I got accepted was the Medical University of South Carolina, which was a great thing, great school. But honestly, I was kind of bummed because I wanted to go back to where I was from, be with friends, be with family, kind of had my life figured out that, hey, I was going to get this degree, I was going to be in this city, and really God ordained my life through this way where I got connected, plugged in with Charleston Bible Church, and something I never would have chosen. And even we were kind of like, hey, we're on the clock, 3 years, get my doctorate degree, and I'm out of here. And we just stayed because that's where God clearly had us. Right. And then we could talk about 100 different things from the adoption of our children. It's like not in my plan. I had plans, tried to walk faithfully in where God had me, and God blessed in tremendous ways, way more than what I would have chosen for myself. I'm very thankful that I did not get what I wanted because my life would have looked tremendously different. Right.
Yeah, very similar story. We grew up just west of Memphis in the great state of Arkansas, and the Navy brought us out here. It was 4 years. We'll be out there 4 years, and we'll come back. And then I got out of the Navy. We were looking for employment, and I even applied at some jobs in Arkansas. None of them picked up. And I got an offer up in Baltimore, and it was like, this did not seem like a good thing. And then lo and behold, we got, God bless us with a really good job here in Charleston. And through that, our heart was, we had already started, the being at CBC and having our heart threads be sewn into this body. And so we were like, okay, well, maybe we'll be out here a little bit longer. We'll see. We bought a house because our family is growing. So we had Lydia. And then right after that, the housing market died. So we couldn't have moved if we wanted to. Yeah, we were fine financially, but we weren't selling it for, that big of a loss. And so it was like God said, nope, you're here. I'm going to incubate you here. And so it's been good. And so like you said, the things that you would not have chosen for yourself that God chose for us for our good and ultimately His glory.
And I think you would probably say this too. It's not that you just, sat by, were applying for this job. Like you mentioned, you were engaged and involved at your local church using your gifts, and God worked through that. It's not, we're just kind of sitting on the side, like, God, figure out my life, and this how happens. It's like, no, we're actively, being obedient at the same time.
Right. All right. Did you want to talk to from faith to faith? What does that phrase mean?
And it could mean a lot of things, right? We read in that theme passage, or even looking at verse 17, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith is ESV. I think it might be say faith to faith in the NASB.
Yeah, that's the right one, I think.
That's clearly the more literal one, what our church uses, so I should have my NASB out. I got a footnote in the ESV that mentions another rendering could be the beginning and ending in faith. And, I've heard people mention this could be, God's faithfulness to our faith. Maybe that's it. I've heard that it could refer to the whole salvation process, big salvation from justification to sanctification. We were talking a little bit before we aired. I think Michael's got a good. Seems like it makes a lot of sense, from the text, what his thoughts are.
Yeah, and the only other thing is I've heard one covenant theology person say that they viewed it as like God's promise to I won't say validate, but to honor, a parent's faith to give it to their children's faith. That seems less likely to me. And I'm not saying all covenant theology people believe that. So I'm not trying to say that that's a reason covenant theology is wrong. That's another possible thing on the table. But I think the ESV note where it says it begins and ends in faith, I think is it the New Living Translation that Joel read from?
Yes.
That says that it's begins and ends with faith, where it's faith in the beginning and faith in the end, something like that. Do you remember exactly what it was?
Man, yeah, I should have that. I don't.
No, it's fine. Yeah. But it's something like that. And I think that's the point is that it's not about works. It's not about, trying to fulfill the law. The gospel is centered on faith. And we're going to see that be a major theme in Romans. We get to Romans 3:21. and it's going to talk about Abraham. There's a righteousness revealed from God that is apart from the law, and it's through faith. So I think that's what he's saying is it's just a faith-based gospel, that it is all centered on faith.
Totally agree. I see you got your boy Greg Kokel quote here.
Yeah. So amongst all of the stuff here in our world, we can be fearful. So part of the point was, that Joel had mentioned was not being ashamed of the gospel and the fear of man. And Greg had mentioned previously, amongst sharing the gospel or a plethora of other biblically based ideas and doctrines that are just going against the grain of culture. I think when you and I grew up, things were starting to change.
I'm not as old as Michael. I want to set the record straight. But anyway, go on.
Yeah. But even as recently as when you grew up, things were at least generally culturally agreeable with basic, things. And we see a lot of things that are going against the Bible these days with questions of sexuality and gender. And so we can be we can be fear-based with those things. And Greg would mention like Pilate, when he was trying Jesus, he said that being afraid of the crowds, he handed him over to be crucified. And so Pilate goes down as the guy who at least legally condemned Jesus. We know that the Jews had a part in that as well. And we have this verse where it says that fear of man brings a snare. I think that's a proverb, whereas the opposite is that fear of God is the beginning of wisdom or the beginning of knowledge, depending on which verse you're looking at. And amongst all of this, Greg has been quoted to say, faithfulness is not theologically complicated. There are some complicated things in the Bible. We tried to ferret out some stuff, but the big points are not theologically complicated. It's not hard to know what God's plan is for marriage. It's not hard to know what God's plan is for a myriad of things. So it's not theologically complicated. It's just, takes us being more afraid / respectful of God and his word than it is of man and our surroundings.
Man, couldn't agree more. That's I know. I am always wrestling with, man, don't let fear of man stop you from these things. And then in our closing minutes here, I wanted to mention verse 15. Paul mentions that I'm eager to preach the gospel to you. I think it's a good thing to think about. Paul's writing to the Christians in Rome, the church at Rome, and he's going to preach the gospel to them. I think what we look at that, and it would be a real mistake to say, man, I'm saved. I've been justified. I've been converted, that I don't really need the gospel anymore. And that's such a narrow focus. And, salvation does include justification by faith alone. Big part of salvation, very important. But as a Christian, as someone who's growing in Christ, someone who's being sanctified and later glorified, I need the gospel every single day. And, Paul's going to go through a lot about the gospel, right, even past when he's talking about justification, right? And so keeping that in mind, he's preaching the gospel to all of us. It's good to evangelize. It's good to be discipled and grow in that faith as well. So just wanted to highlight that.
Yeah, and I'll just make one additional comment on top of that. So I mentioned last podcast, 2 podcasts ago, that maybe both, but anyways, that I had 2 false salvation experiences. And during that time, when I would have said I was a believer, but I wasn't truly a believer, if I heard the gospel, I was kind of annoyed. I was like, this is like, can we, we all know this.
Yeah.
Can we move on to the interesting stuff of the Bible? And so I have, when I was doing youth and when I've talked to youth, that's been one of the first sign that maybe you're not really a believer is if we have a message or a sermon that's centered on the gospel, the foundation of what it means to be a Christ follower. And you're kind of annoyed at that, and you don't your heartstrings don't get pulled a little bit because you think, oh man, but for the grace of God, I could be in hell. I could have a life that's just totally different than maybe you're not a believer, and so that might be a first check for you. Are you truly a believer? Because Paul is eager to talk about the gospel, and he lives and breathes the gospel, and he's all about it.
All about it. And then I have one last quote I want to say, and then anything else you're thinking of, Michael. But going back kind of to the gospel is offensive. We're in our college group, we're about to start a study kind of walking through Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, and came across this really good quote about the gospel. And what C.S. Lewis says here when talking about Christianity is that Christianity, it presents very terrifying facts. He says, I wish it was possible to say something more agreeable, but I must say what I think is true. Of course, I quite agree that the Christian religion is, in the long run, a thing of unspeakable comfort, but it does not begin in comfort. It begins in dismay. Religion, just like in war and everything else, comfort is the one thing you can't get by looking for it. If you look for truth, then you might find comfort in the end. If you look for comfort, you'll not get either comfort or truth. Only soft soap and wishful thinking to begin with, and in the end, despair. That the gospel, it's a hard pill to swallow. You've got to admit a lot of things are broken about you, but man, that leads to great comfort because we have someone, as Michael mentioned, is the just and the justifier of our faith. If you're just looking for comfort, man, that's might seem like the right decision now, but that ends in despair. We need that truth of the gospel.
Yep. All right, well, thank you for joining us for Take 2. That's our take, but we encourage you to get into the gospel and to read these verses and come up with your own take.
Thanks for listening to Take 2. Find us wherever you find podcasts and on YouTube for those who want to watch our videocast.